Imagine it's January 30th, 2026. You are one of 200 auto workers walking out of the General Motors plant in Oshawa into the frigid cold for the very last time. Your job, and the security it provided your family, is gone. That same week, GM's stock value jumps 5%, closing at a healthy $84 a share. The headlines you read blame American tariffs and corporate restructuring, a familiar, sad story of inevitable decline. But that narrative is a convenient distraction. Because while this American industrial icon was firing Canadians, a surprising ally from across the Pacific was quietly cementing its role as the industry's true backbone. The story everyone missed isn't about who left, but about who stayed. And it reveals how Japan secretly orchestrated a rescue of Canadian manufacturing that almost nobody even noticed. For over half a century, a single handshake deal defined the Canadian auto industry. It was called the Auto Pact, signed back in 1965. The idea was simple: erase the border for cars and parts between Canada and the United States. This created one massive integrated market. For decades, it was a golden ticket. Canadian plants became essential pillars of a North American manufacturing empire, building vehicles for a continent. You could build a car in Ontario and sell it in Ohio like it was next door. But that foundation has been cracking for years. Look at the raw numbers. Canada's annual vehicle production has been cut nearly in half from what it was just a decade ago. Think about that. For every 2 cars rolling off an assembly line 10 years ago, today there's only 1. This created a dangerous dependency, a kind of economic vulnerability I call the Southern Anchor. With only 20% of new cars sold in Canada being domestically made, the entire industry's health was tied to the mood of its American customer. Then, that mood soured. When the Trump administration rolled out punishing metal tariffs, the integrated market suddenly became a gilded cage. What was once a benefit, seamless cross-border production, was now a liability. For a company like General Motors, the tariffs became the perfect cover. A convenient excuse to justify reducing their Canadian footprint, a move many analysts believed they wanted to make anyway. The Southern Anchor was no longer holding the industry steady. It was dragging it down. As the decades-old partnership with American automakers began to rust and break apart, a different kind of relationship was quietly being forged. The very political pressures pushing one giant out were creating an opening for another. But how could a trade war designed to cripple competitors accidentally create the perfect conditions for a rescue? And why would Japan, of all countries, be the one to step in? This isn't just about a few thousand factory jobs. This is about the financial bedrock of the country. Your country. Look at the raw numbers. Canada's annual vehicle production has been slashed nearly in half from what it was just 10 years ago. Half. Gone. When you walk onto a dealership lot today, only 20% of the new cars for sale are actually built domestically. This is what I call the industrial fade. A quiet bleeding out of the high-paying jobs that support main streets, mortgages, and entire communities. It's a slow-motion crisis that shows up not just in pink slips, but in the value of your home, the taxes that fund your schools, and the opportunities available for the next generation. The entire economic model that guaranteed a middle-class life for millions is becoming dangerously thin. The old promises are breaking, one factory shift at a time. So how did the foundation of Canadian manufacturing get so fragile that a single American company could shake it to its core? To understand the crisis, you have to rewind the clock, not to the 60s, but to the 80s and 90s. This is when the ground began to shift. While American automakers like General Motors operated within a comfortable North American system, a new set of players arrived from across the Pacific: Toyota and Honda. They weren't just looking for new customers, they were fleeing a trade war. At the time, Washington was threatening crippling tariffs on Japanese imports. And for Japan, that was an existential threat. Think about this. Automobiles make up nearly 28.3% of Japan's total exports to the United States. That's a $63 billion pipeline, a pipeline that was about to be shut off. So they devised a brilliant solution, a strategy you could call the Maple Leaf bypass. Why fight a trade war when you can simply move your factories inside the enemy's fortress? By building plants in Ontario, Japanese automakers became North American automakers. Their cars, now assembled by Canadian hands in places like Alliston and Cambridge, could flow across the border, bypassing the tariff wall completely. It was a geopolitical chess move. using factories as pawns to secure access to the world's richest market. While Detroit was beginning its long, slow retreat from Canada, these companies were digging in, investing billions in building a new industrial base. But simply building factories was only step one. To truly understand how they secured their position, and in doing so, created a safety net for the entire Canadian auto sector, you have to look past the assembly lines. You have to find the hidden mechanism. So how does this silent rescue actually work? It's not a secret treaty. It's a powerful economic mechanism, a quiet reversal of industrial gravity. I call it the production inversion. Think of the North American auto industry as a massive river, its current flowing south for decades. Parts and labor moved across the border with ease. But what happens when one country decides to build a dam? The flow chokes. The riverbed dries up. For factories on the Canadian side, this should have been a death sentence. But another powerful current, flowing from across the Pacific, was about to change course. Here's how the production inversion works, step by step. First, the trigger. The United States government introduces trade uncertainty. Tariffs, political threats, and a new nationalism make the deeply integrated system a massive liability for American car companies. The old handshake deal is off. Second, the American retreat. Legacy automakers use this chaos as the perfect cover to shrink their Canadian footprint. It's a simple calculation to please shareholders. Look at General Motors. The same week they finalized major cuts in Canada, their stock closed at a healthy $84 a share. The market rewarded the retreat. Third, the Japanese calculation. Automakers in Japan look at the same map, but see something completely different. They don't see a liability, they see an opportunity. They have a $63 billion annual export market in the U.S. to protect. They cannot afford to be shut out. They need a stable, reliable platform inside the North American fortress. And that leads to the final step, the inversion. Canada becomes their geopolitical safe harbor. While American investment flows out, Japanese investment holds the line. They see a world-class workforce and infrastructure being abandoned, and they secure it. The entire economic current begins to shift from a north-south axis to an east-west one. This isn't just a political theory. It's a strategy you can measure. The proof isn't in politicians' speeches. It's written in steel, rubber, and dollars. And when you run the numbers, the scale of this silent transfer of power is staggering. To see the crisis in action, you don't need a spreadsheet. You just need to look at one company, one town, and one brutal week in winter. The first major victim was General Motors in Oshawa, Ontario. Consider the optics. During the exact same week that hundreds of Canadian workers were preparing for their final shift, the value of GM stock was climbing. For investors, the news was good. By the time the factory doors were locked, shares closed the week at $84. A tidy profit. For the people on the ground, it was a different story. At 6:30 in the morning, the entire third shift, the midnight crew, clocked out for the last time and walked into an uncertain future. These weren't just jobs. They were careers, mortgages, and college funds, vaporized overnight. This wasn't just a business decision. It was a broken contract. Canada's industry minister immediately demanded the return of hundreds of millions in taxpayer dollars. This is a pattern I call the bailout betrayal. A government invests public money to secure jobs, the corporation takes the cash, and then eliminates the jobs anyway, leaving taxpayers with the bill and workers with nothing. The risk is socialized, but the profit is privatized. Publicly, the company blamed market forces. But many analysts pointed to a different cause. They accused General Motors of using American metal tariffs as convenient cover, an excuse to execute a long-planned reduction of its Canadian industrial footprint. It was a strategic retreat disguised as a tactical necessity. The handshake deal that built this industry was being replaced by a corporate calculation where Canadian jobs were simply a rounding error on a balance sheet. The shockwave from the Oshawa closure was felt across the country. It was a chilling preview of what happens when a nation's industrial core becomes dependent on the goodwill of a foreign corporation. A single decision, made in a boardroom 1,000 kilometers away, could cripple an entire community. But this was just the beginning. So how does this silent rescue actually work? It isn't a government program or a secret handshake. It's a mechanism of pure, cold economic logic. A powerful force that redirects billions of dollars and thousands of jobs based on a simple calculation of risk. I call it the geographic arbitrage. To understand it, imagine two identical factories. One is in Michigan, the other is just across the border in Ontario. For decades, under the old pact, they were treated as one and the same. Parts and cars flowed freely. But then, the rules changed. The United States began introducing friction, like metal tariffs, creating tiny economic walls along that once invisible border. This is the first step, the friction. For an American company like General Motors, this friction is a direct hit to its integrated system. Suddenly, shipping a part from Ontario to Michigan and back again has a new cost, a new delay, a new political risk. The simplest solution? Retreat. Consolidate production inside your own borders. This is exactly what happened in Oshawa. 500 workers on one shift are let go, and Wall Street celebrates. GM's stock price climbs to $84 a share. The market rewards the retreat. But now, look at that same equation from the perspective of a Japanese automaker. Their goal is different. They aren't trying to optimize a legacy North American system. Their primary objective is building vehicles to sell to the massive American market. They already have huge, modern plants in Canada, and this is where the arbitrage happens. For Toyota or Honda, the Canadian factory suddenly becomes a strategic asset. It's a stable, predictable manufacturing base, right on the doorstep of their biggest customer, but insulated from the direct political turbulence south of the border. Canada becomes a safe harbor. Why build a new plant in a country where tariffs could change with a single tweet when you have a world-class facility in a country that offers stability? You don't. You double down on what works. This is why most people miss it. The GM closure is a loud, singular event. It makes headlines. The Japanese countermove is quiet. It's a series of individual investment decisions, made in boardrooms in Tokyo, that add up over a decade. It's not a dramatic rescue. It's a slow, steady transfer of industrial gravity, a quiet rerouting of the $63 billion automotive export machine. But this isn't just a theory. The proof is etched into the balance sheets and the production schedules. When you follow the money, the trend becomes undeniable, and the numbers tell a story that is far more shocking than any single factory closure. The silence in Oshawa didn't last long. It was an echo. Before the headlines could even fade, the next domino fell. The shockwave traveled 300 kilometers west, slamming into Ingersoll, Ontario. Another General Motors plant, another round of layoffs, another community hollowed out. This wasn't a coincidence, it was a cascade. This cascade reveals a deep, structural vulnerability that's been ignored for half a century. I call it the foreign switch. For American-owned auto giants, Canadian factories have always been the easiest switch to flip. When profits are up, the switch is on. The assembly lines run hot, but the moment Wall Street gets nervous, or a new protectionist wind blows from Washington, that switch gets flipped off, instantly. Canadian operations are the system's shock absorber. They are designed to be the first to break, protecting the core operations back in Michigan and Ohio. Look at the brutal calculus. The same week, 1,200 Canadian workers lost their livelihoods. GM stock closed the week higher at $84 a share. The market didn't just tolerate the cuts. It rewarded them. Your job security was traded for a few points on the Dow Jones. And the lessons from this? They haven't been learned. You see the Canadian government trying to play two games at once. With one hand, the industry minister publicly demands GM return hundreds of millions in taxpayer subsidies, a tough stance for the cameras. But with the other hand, officials are quietly planning to scrap environmental rules and create new financial incentives, hoping to lure the next corporate giant in. It's a desperate cycle of being betrayed, demanding an apology, and then immediately offering a gift to the next person who walks in the door. It treats the symptom, but ignores the disease. This isn't just an abstract economic debate between politicians and CEOs. Those hundreds of millions of dollars GM was given, the money now being fought over in press releases, that wasn't government money. It was your money. And here's where it gets personal. The cold logic of the market is written in numbers. While 200 families in Oshawa planned for a future without a paycheck, General Motors shareholders saw their stock jump 5% in a single week. A 5% gain on a company that size isn't just pocket change. It's billions of dollars in new wealth, created in the same 5 days that a community's bedrock was vaporized. Let's call this what it is, the severance premium. On one side of the ledger, you have the lost wages. Let's be conservative and say the average annual income was $70,000. That's $84 million a year, erased from a single Canadian town. On the other side, Billions added to the company's valuation. The market paid a premium for the cuts. Now, look at a different set of numbers. While that $84 million was draining out of Ontario, a much larger financial current was flowing in from across the Pacific. Every year, Japanese automakers export $63 billion worth of vehicles to the United States alone. A significant portion of that $63 billion arsenal is assembled not in Yokohama, but in towns like Alliston and Cambridge, Ontario. This isn't a rounding error. It's a strategic counterbalance. For every dollar of wages GM erased to please Wall Street, Japanese investment was pumping multiples of that back into the Canadian economy, funding tens of thousands of other jobs. The math is brutal. Without that $63 billion pipeline, the $84 million hole in Oshawa wouldn't be a tragedy. It would be a national catastrophe. This delicate balance, however, raises terrifying new questions. It exposes a deep vulnerability. What happens if that pipeline gets shut off? What if the rescuer suddenly needs rescuing themselves? Now, the skeptics will tell you this whole story is a fantasy. They have a simple, compelling argument. This isn't about a quiet rescue. It's about political cover. They'll say General Motors was just using tariffs as a convenient excuse to do what they always wanted to do, cut their Canadian footprint and chase cheaper labor. It's an easy narrative to believe. It paints a clear villain and a clear motive. And to be fair, they aren't entirely wrong. The political friction certainly didn't help. It was a contributing factor. But blaming everything on a tariff is like blaming a single gust of wind for knocking over a rotten tree. The real problem was deep in the roots. The uncomfortable truth is that for years, many North American-run plants in Canada simply weren't making the cars that people were lining up to buy. While Japanese automakers were pumping out $63 billion worth of vehicles to the U.S. market alone each year, domestic producers were struggling to keep up with consumer demand for smaller, more reliable, more efficient cars. The market had been sending signals for a decade, but nobody in Detroit's boardrooms seemed to be listening. The tariffs weren't the cause of the crisis. They were just the fever that revealed the underlying disease. The political noise was a distraction from the cold, hard math of the showroom floor. The jobs weren't leaving because of a policy. They were leaving because the demand was going somewhere else. But even if they were right, so what happens next? Where does this precarious balance lead? The data points toward two very different futures. First, there is Scenario A, the conservative forecast. Let's call it the slow erosion. In this future, the pattern we've seen simply continues. American automakers keep trimming their Canadian footprint, one shift at a time, one component plant at a time. Each cut is explained away by market forces or political pressure from Washington. Wall Street actively rewards it. GM stock jumped to $84 a share the week they announced the Oshawa layoffs. In this scenario, Japanese investment acts as a crucial brake, a stabilizing force. It absorbs some of the laid-off workers, it keeps key suppliers afloat, but it can't reverse the tide. The industry doesn't collapse overnight. It just fades year by year. It's a managed decline, not a rescue. Then there is Scenario B, the stress test. This is the great unplugging. Imagine a sudden political or economic shock, a new, more aggressive trade war, or a deep global recession. This triggers a rapid, systemic withdrawal of all remaining American capital. In this future, the Japanese buffer is overwhelmed. Their $63 billion export machine to the U.S. is a powerful anchor, but it's not designed to carry the weight of an entire collapsing industry on its own. The probability of this is much lower, but the consequences would be catastrophic, turning southern Ontario's industrial heartland into a rust belt in a matter of months, not decades. Now, skeptics will argue this is just fear-mongering, that global supply chains are too integrated for such a clean break to ever happen. Now, a healthy dose of skepticism is required here. The official story, the one you'll hear from financial news anchors, is much simpler. They'll tell you this is just a political calculation. The argument goes like this. General Motors isn't making a strategic retreat, they're just using the administration's metal tariffs as a convenient excuse. A political smokescreen to justify cutting Canadian jobs they wanted to cut anyway. It's a clean, cynical narrative. It fits what we know about corporate behavior. And honestly, it's almost convincing. Almost. But this political alibi completely falls apart when you look at who isn't packing their bags. If this were just about tariffs, if it was simply a bad environment for every automaker, then why are Toyota and Honda doubling down? They operate under the same sky, facing the same political pressures and the same market headwinds. Yet their plants in Alliston and Cambridge aren't just holding the line. They're retooling for the future, investing billions into the next generation of vehicles. The most powerful beta here isn't a single number on a spreadsheet. It is the stark divergence in corporate strategy. While one American giant sees Canada as a liability to be managed, two Japanese giants see it as a strategic asset to be developed. This isn't a universal trend. It's a targeted withdrawal met by a quiet, deliberate reinforcement. That discrepancy is a giant red flag. It proves the easy answer is the wrong one. And this is where I have to step in and tell you what I believe is really happening. This isn't about a political excuse. It's about a calculated economic choice. A choice that reveals a hidden alliance quietly reshaping the entire continent. So where do I put my own money? Before I say another word, the mandatory disclaimer. I am not a financial advisor, and this is not advice. This is my personal playbook, built for my own risk tolerance. I'm watching this entire situation not as a bystander, but as an investor looking for patterns the market has missed. I call my strategy the Pacific Pivot. It's a simple thesis. As American industrial anchors in Canada get lighter, Japanese capital will fill the void. I'm not betting against General Motors directly. Instead, I'm taking small, calculated positions in the companies that stand to gain from their retreat. My primary trigger isn't a news headline. It's a market reaction. When GM stock closed at $84 a share after announcing layoffs, that was my signal. It confirmed the market was rewarding the very behavior that creates this opportunity. My position sizing is conservative, a 3 to 5% allocation of my speculative capital. This isn't a bet the farm move. It's a calculated hedge against a predictable decline. But this small hedge is just the defensive play. The real opportunity, the move that could generate asymmetric returns, is still waiting in the wings. There's a specific political catalyst, a piece of legislation being quietly discussed, that could ignite a full-blown rally in these forgotten stocks. The old American handshake is broken. A quiet, unspoken alliance with Japan is the only thing preventing a total collapse. But make no mistake, this is not a rescue. It is a strategic calculation, an economic anchor dropped in a storm. And that anchor can be pulled at any moment. One tariff, one election, one diplomatic misstep, and the entire system could implode, taking entire towns down with it. Your security, your mortgage, now depends on decisions made an ocean away. This is just the first front. The same forces are now targeting Canada's resources, and the numbers are staggering. We're following the capital flows that nobody is talking about. To understand the next chapter of this story, you need to see our investigation. The factory floor has a new landlord, and the rent is coming due.